and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. I was about 10 years old when this happened. I was home alone during a really bad rainstorm. The rain had been coming down hard for a while, and there was enough thunder and lightning around that I was already worried the power might go out. I had been playing on my Polystation, but because I was afraid a sudden blackout might damage it, I decided to switch it off. Of course, being 10 years old, my next brilliant idea was to turn on the television. Apparently, the TV was somehow immune to the same blackout I was worried about. That was childhood logic. My parents were at my grandmother's house, which was not very far from ours. Normally, I could have gone with them, but I had not wanted to stay there anymore. I would rather be home playing games and watching television. They had walked to my grandmother's house because she lived close enough that driving was not necessary. By the time the storm became really heavy, though, I knew they were probably not going to come home immediately. They would have to walk back through the rain. So I understood that for at least a while, I was completely on my own. At first, that did not bother me. I liked being trusted to stay home. There was something exciting about having the television to myself and not having anyone telling me what to watch or when to stop playing. I started flipping through channels, trying to find something interesting. There was not much on. The longer I searched, the more bored I became. That was when I remembered the VHS tape. My parents owned an old copy of The Exorcist. Even before I had ever seen the movie, I knew it had a reputation in my family. My parents had talked about it more than once. They always treated that movie differently from other horror films. They had apparently had some unsettling experiences connected to it in the past, or at least that was the way they described it to me. I never completely understood what had happened. Maybe something strange occurred while they were watching it years earlier. Maybe the movie simply scared them badly enough that the memory grew into something bigger over time. Whatever the reason, they had warned me about it. That warning made the VHS more interesting. Children here do not watch this and immediately start wondering what could possibly be so terrible. By then, I was old enough to believe I could handle almost anything. At least I wanted to believe that. I thought if I watched the whole movie and did not get scared, I could later tell my parents that they had exaggerated everything. I would prove I was brave. Maybe they would be impressed. Maybe I would get to make fun of them a little. I imagined myself saying something like, "That wasn't even scary." That was enough motivation. The storm was still raging outside. Rain hit the windows. Thunder came and went in the distance, and for some reason, I decided that this was the perfect time to watch the one horror movie my parents had specifically warned me about. I found the VHS and put it into the player. The tape was old. It had been in the house for years. The image quality was not perfect. Anyone who grew up with VHS tapes remembers what old recordings could look like. The picture could flicker. Colors could wash out. Lines sometimes rolled through the image. Tracking problems could make parts of the screen jump or distort. If a tape had been watched many times, sections could become damaged. At 10 years old, I did not think much about any of that. The movie started. I sat down and watched. At first, I was mostly trying to prove something to myself. Whenever something frightening happened, I told myself it was only a movie. Actors, makeup, special effects, nothing real. I was alone, but I kept reminding myself that my parents were only a short walk away. If I became too frightened, I could stop the tape. I could turn on something else. I could even run to my grandmother's house. I did not want to do any of those things because that would mean admitting the movie had beaten me. So I continued watching. The rain outside became part of the experience. Whenever the movie became quiet, I could hear water hitting the roof and windows. Then thunder would roll outside the real house. Sometimes it happened close enough to something on the television that it almost felt synchronized. That made everything much more intense. Still, I kept watching. I made it through most of the movie. By that point, I had begun feeling proud of myself. I was scared, obviously, but I had not turned it off. I was going to finish it. Then there was a scene showing the outside of a house in the rain. I looked at the screen, and I froze. The house on the television looked like my house, not similar in the general sense, not just another building with the same number of windows. For those few seconds, I was convinced I was looking at our actual home, my house, the place where I was sitting at that exact moment. The rain on the screen made it worse because it was raining heavily outside in real life, too. I stared. I could not understand what I was seeing. There was no reason our house should be in this movie. It made absolutely no sense. The film had been made long before I was born. We were nowhere near the location where it had been filmed. My parents had owned that VHS for years. There was no possible way the tape suddenly contained footage of our home. Yet that was what I saw. For maybe 4 or 5 seconds, I could not take my eyes off the screen. I remember trying to compare details, the shape of the house, the front, the windows, the surroundings. Everything in me was saying, that's our house. I did not even have time to fully process it. Lightning flashed outside. Almost immediately, there was a huge crack of thunder. Then every light in the house went out. The television died. The entire room disappeared into darkness. That was it for me. Whatever courage I had been trying to prove I possessed vanished instantly. I did not wait for the electricity to come back. I did not go looking for a flashlight. I did not check the fuse box. I did not stop and think about whether the blackout was obviously caused by the thunderstorm. I ran. I went straight out of the house and into the rain. I was not even wearing a shirt. I did not care. I would rather stand outside half-dressed in a violent storm than stay alone in that dark house for another second. The rain hit me immediately. Within moments, I was soaked. I ran toward my grandmother's house. I was scared enough that I barely noticed the cold. My mind was still stuck on the image from the VHS, our house, on the screen, then the power disappearing at exactly that moment. At 10 years old, that did not feel like a coincidence. It felt like I had done something I had been warned not to do, and something had responded. I think that was the first time in my life I understood the feeling of genuine dread. Not being startled. Not jumping because of a loud noise in a movie. Dread. The feeling that something had noticed you. I eventually reached my parents. I told them what happened. I expected them to be angry that I had watched the VHS after being warned. Maybe they were. What I remember most clearly is that they did not believe my story about the house appearing on the television. At least, they said they did not believe me. They probably thought I had scared myself. From an adult perspective, that is the obvious explanation. I was 10. I was alone during a storm. I was watching a horror movie I had already been told was dangerous or frightening. My imagination was primed before the tape even started. By the time I saw a house on screen during a rainy scene, my brain could easily have interpreted it as my own. Many houses share similar designs, especially older homes. A certain roof shape, window placement, porch, or front entrance might have been enough. Because I was frightened and focused, I could have seen the similarities and ignored the differences. Then lightning caused an actual blackout seconds later. The timing turned a simple mistake in recognition into something terrifying. That explanation makes perfect sense. It is probably what happened. But my parents' reaction afterward is one of the reasons the memory stayed with me. They got rid of the VHS, not only the tape. They also threw away the television, the old VHS player, and even my Polystation. That felt strange. If they truly believed I had imagined everything, why get rid of all the equipment? Maybe the storm had damaged the electronics. A lightning strike or power surge can destroy televisions, game systems, and video players. If the blackout had affected the electrical system, throwing away damaged devices would be completely reasonable. Maybe that is exactly what happened. My 10-year-old brain connected their decision to my story, but they may simply have discovered that the electronics no longer worked properly. Still, I remember thinking that they believed me more than they admitted. They said it was nothing. Then they removed everything connected to that night. The VHS disappeared. The television disappeared. The tape player disappeared. My game system disappeared too. From my perspective, it felt like they wanted every part of the incident out of the house. I never saw that copy of the movie again. For years afterward, even hearing someone mention The Exorcist made me uncomfortable. It still does. I can talk about horror movies normally. I can hear people discuss ghosts, possession stories, haunted houses, and other things without freezing. But when that particular movie comes up, my mind immediately returns to that storm. I see myself sitting alone in front of the television. I hear the rain. I see that house appear on screen. Then darkness. I have tried many times to find a rational explanation. The strongest one is simple misidentification. There is a famous tendency for people to recognize familiar shapes in unrelated things. Faces in clouds, animals in shadows, a person in a pile of clothing. Houses are no different. If the movie showed a building with even a rough resemblance to ours, a frightened child could easily decide it was the same place. The fact that the scene included rain would have made the match feel stronger, because the weather outside my real house was nearly identical. My environment and the film blended together. That kind of coincidence can be incredibly effective on the mind. The VHS itself may also have been damaged. Old tapes sometimes produce brief ghost images from other recordings. If the tape had previously been recorded over, there could have been remnants of another program beneath the movie. Home-recorded VHS tapes could contain pieces of television broadcasts, commercials, or family recordings. But as far as I know, this was a regular copy of the film, not something my parents recorded themselves. Even if another image somehow appeared because of tape damage, there is no reason it would contain our actual house. At most, a visual glitch could have created a distorted building that my mind recognized incorrectly. The storm could also have interfered with the television itself. Electrical fluctuations sometimes distort analog images before the power cuts completely. The picture could stretch Colors could change. Part of the frame could freeze. A brief voltage drop could make the image look completely different. Maybe in the seconds before the blackout, the television was already malfunctioning. The house on the screen may have become distorted enough to resemble ours. Then lightning finished the job and the power failed. That would create exactly the sequence I remember without requiring anything supernatural. Another possibility is that the scene did not actually resemble our house as closely as I remember. Memory changes. I have replayed the experience in my head for years. Each time I remember it, I am remembering not only the original event, but also previous memories of it. Details can become sharper. The resemblance can become stronger. What I saw at 10 may have been, that kind of looks like our house. After years of retelling it internally, that becomes, it was our house. That happens to everyone. It does not mean the memory is fake. It means memory is reconstructed. The emotional core stays while visual details become less reliable. The 4 or 5 seconds I remember staring could also have been shorter. Maybe it was 1 second. Maybe the lightning happened almost immediately, and my memory stretched the moment because of the fear. When something shocking happens, time can feel strange. A few seconds can become a long sequence. I might remember having time to study the house, even though the entire thing happened almost instantly. There is another explanation I have considered. Maybe I fell asleep for a few moments. I had been watching a long movie late in the day while alone and possibly tired. A brief dream could have blended with the television. I might have imagined seeing my own house on the screen. Then the thunder woke me as the electricity failed. The combination would feel completely real, but I do not remember being sleepy. I remember being very focused because I was trying to prove I could handle the movie. Still, people can drift off without realizing it. A micro-sleep or a brief dream is possible. The problem is that none of these explanations changes what I experienced emotionally. At 10 years old, I did not see a similar house. I saw mine. That is the memory. It felt impossible. And the blackout arrived before I had enough time to convince myself otherwise. I sometimes wonder what I would have done if the power had stayed on. Would I have paused the tape? Would I have rewound it? Would I have looked at the house again and realized I was mistaken? That is probably what would have happened. If I had been able to replay the scene, I might have immediately seen all the differences. Different windows, different roof, different yard, different location. The entire mystery could have disappeared in 30 seconds. Instead, the storm took away my chance to check. That was probably the worst possible timing. Because the screen went black, the image remained frozen in my memory exactly as I had first interpreted it. I never got to correct myself. I never watched that tape again. My parents threw it out, so the version in my head became permanent. That is one reason unresolved experiences can feel supernatural for so long. There is no second look, no experiment, no chance to recreate what happened. The moment ends before you can investigate. Then everything afterward is memory. I've also wondered whether my parents' warnings about the movie planted the idea that something bad would happen. Before I pressed play, I already knew they associated the film with frightening experiences. Even if they had never told me specific details, that warning was enough. I expected something. Maybe not consciously, but the expectation was there. Every creak in the house mattered more. Every thunderclap seemed connected to the movie. When the film showed a rainy exterior, my brain searched for familiarity. Then the power went out. If I had been watching a comedy, the exact same blackout, would probably have annoyed me. I might have said something rude, waited for the lights to come back, and continued watching. Because it happened during The Exorcist, it became evidence. Context changed everything. That is the explanation I would give if someone else told me this story. A frightened child watched a forbidden horror movie alone during a severe thunderstorm. He misidentified a house on screen as his own. Lightning caused a power failure at exactly the wrong moment. He panicked and ran to his parents. The adults later threw away electronics that may have been damaged by the surge. Over time, the memory became more intense because of how frightened he had been. That is reasonable. I accept it. But I cannot make myself feel completely comfortable with it. The detail that bothers me is how certain I was before the blackout. I did not see the house after the lights went out, and later decide it must have resembled mine. I recognized it while the television was still working. I stared at it. My reaction happened first. The thunder came after. Maybe only by a few seconds, but that order matters in my memory. I had already thought, that's my house. Then everything died. It felt like the television had shown me something it was not supposed to show. That was the thought that sent me running. Not simply that the movie was scary. It was the feeling that the boundary between the film and my actual home had disappeared. A horror movie is safe because it stays inside the screen. No matter what happens to the characters, you are sitting somewhere else. Your room is outside the story. Your family is outside it. Your house is outside it. For those few seconds, that did not feel true anymore. The house on the screen was where I was. The storm in the movie was the storm outside. Then the screen and every light around me died at once. At 10 years old, I felt as though the movie had reached out of the television. That is why I ran shirtless into the rain without thinking. The real thunderstorm was less frightening than staying inside. Outside, I could move. I could see flashes of lightning. I knew where my parents were. Inside the house, I no longer trusted what might appear if the electricity came back. I think that is what frightened me most. What if the TV turned itself back on? What would be on the screen then? Would the movie continue normally? Would the house still be there? Would I see something standing outside it? Would I see myself? Those thoughts came later, but the instinct was already there. Get out. So I did. My parents never gave me an explanation that satisfied me. They did not sit me down and explain tape distortion or voltage drops. They mostly treated it as a frightened child getting carried away. Maybe that was the right thing to do. If they had acted terrified too, the experience might have affected me even more. Still, throwing everything away sent a mixed message. They said it was nothing. Then the VHS was gone. The television was gone. The VHS player was gone. Even the Poly station was gone. Maybe those devices had been damaged. Maybe my parents simply decided I had proven I was not responsible enough to be home alone watching forbidden movies. I can laugh about that possibility now. Losing the Poly station may have been the real punishment. But part of me still remembers their earlier warnings about that tape. They already thought there was something wrong with it before I ever watched it. That makes their decision afterward feel different. I have never wanted to track down the same version of the VHS and check the scene. Logically, that would probably solve everything. Find the same release. Watch it. Pause on the rainy exterior. Compare the house to the one I grew up in. Maybe the resemblance would be obvious but ordinary. Maybe I would finally see that they were completely different. But I do not want to. That is not a rational decision. I know that. I simply have no desire to put myself back into that memory more deeply than necessary. The event was powerful enough that even hearing the movie mentioned can make my body react before I have time to think. I tense. I remember the rain. I try not to listen to people talking about it. It is almost embarrassing because I know it is only a film. Millions of people have watched it. Nothing happens to them. But fear attaches itself to very specific things. For me, it attached itself to that title. I can separate the movie itself from what happened intellectually. Emotionally, they are still connected. Sometimes I wonder whether the scariest part of childhood experiences like this is not the possibility of ghosts or curses. It is how little control you have. I was 10. My parents were somewhere else. The storm controlled the electricity. The television controlled what image appeared. I had no phone in my hand to instantly call someone. I could not search online and compare screenshots. Once the lights disappeared, I had no way to know when they would return. Running to my grandmother's house was the only action that felt like control. So I ran. If this happened to me now, I would behave completely differently. I would use my phone flashlight. I would check the breaker. I would wait for the power. I would probably laugh at myself for getting frightened by an old horror film. If the television came back on, I would rewind the scene and look again. I might even take a picture. At 10, none of those things happened. I only had fear. That is why the memory remains so clean. Storm, movie, house, lightning, darkness, run. There's probably nothing supernatural in that sequence. Thunderstorms cause blackouts all the time. Children misidentify images. Old VHS tapes distort. Parents throw away damaged electronics. Fear fills in gaps. Every piece has an explanation. I know that, but the experience still feels different from an ordinary childhood scare. I did not run because something in the movie looked frightening. I ran because for 4 or 5 seconds I believed the movie had stopped showing someone else's house and started showing mine. Then, before I could decide whether I was imagining it, the whole house went black. I never saw that tape again. My parents made sure of that. And even now, years later, when someone says the name of that movie, the first thing I remember is not anything from the film itself. I remember sitting alone while rain hammered against our windows, staring at an old television, and realizing that the house on the other side of the screen looked exactly like the one I was sitting inside. Then lightning flashed. The screen died. And I ran into the storm because at 10 years old, getting as far away from my own house as possible suddenly felt safer than staying inside it. I was about 15 when my family moved into a new house. The previous owner had been an elderly woman in her 90s who had recently died, which was why the house had become available. At the time, I did not think much about that. People die in houses all the time, especially people who have lived somewhere for decades. An old person dying does not automatically make a place haunted, and I was not walking around expecting to see her ghost. Mostly, I was adjusting to a new home. New houses always feel strange at first, even when there is nothing wrong with them. You do not know all the sounds yet. You do not know which floorboards creak, which pipes knock, or how shadows fall through the windows at different times of day. A doorway that looks perfectly normal in daylight can look completely different in the evening. Every sound makes you stop for a second, because your brain has not yet learned what belongs there. Our house had a fairly long hallway. At one end was a utility room. There was nothing especially frightening about it. It was just one of those practical rooms where household things were kept. But because it sat at the end of a hallway, The doorway was visible from farther back in the house. One day, not long after we had moved in, my family was getting ready to go shopping. I was already downstairs, waiting near the front door. Everyone else was still getting ready somewhere upstairs. I remember standing there, probably impatient and ready to leave, when for some reason I glanced down the hallway. It was not a careful look. I did not stop and stare. My eyes passed over the utility room doorway for maybe half a second. But in that half second, I saw what looked like a person standing there. A silhouette. That was all. A dark human shape standing in the doorway. I did not immediately become frightened. In fact, I barely reacted. My brain did what it normally does when it catches something in peripheral vision. It filled in the most obvious explanation. Someone from my family must be standing there. Maybe my mother, maybe another relative. Someone had come downstairs without me noticing. So I looked away. There was no reason to think anything strange had happened. Then everyone who was supposed to be inside the house came downstairs together. I watched them come down the stairs, one after another. That was when the image from the hallway came back to me. I remember thinking, wait, if all of them were upstairs, who did I just see? I looked toward the utility room again. Nobody was there. That was the first moment I felt genuinely uncomfortable. I started going through possible explanations immediately. Maybe one of them had been downstairs a few seconds earlier and gone back up, but that did not seem right. Maybe I had seen a coat hanging near the doorway, a mop, a vacuum cleaner, a pile of laundry. Anything roughly vertical can look like a person when you only look at it for a fraction of a second. So I went closer and checked. I looked inside and around the utility room. I tried to find an object that matched what I thought I had seen. Nothing did. There was no coat hanging in that position. No tall object standing where the silhouette had appeared. Nothing that made me think, there it is. That is obviously what I mistook for a person. That bothered me more than the original glimpse. If I had found a broom leaning against the wall with a jacket draped over it, the whole thing would have ended there. Instead, the doorway looked empty. Normal, I had caught the image so quickly that I could not describe details. There had been no face, no clothing, no movement. Just the unmistakable impression of a human figure. Because it lasted only half a second, I knew my eyes could have been wrong. Peripheral vision is not reliable for detail. The brain is especially good at detecting human shapes, sometimes too good. We see faces in patterns and people in shadows because recognizing another person quickly has always been useful. A dark doorway can become a human silhouette with very little information. I understood that. So I did not start telling everyone the house was haunted. I went shopping with my family and tried to put it out of my mind. If that had been the only strange thing that happened, I probably would have forgotten it. But less than 2 days later, something happened with our dog. Our dog was not the type to behave unpredictably. He was generally calm and familiar with the family. Obviously, dogs bark, but he was not known for suddenly losing his mind at nothing. That made his behavior stand out. One day, he began barking aggressively inside the house. Not a few warning barks at a noise outside. He kept going. He seemed focused on empty space. There was no person standing where he was looking. No obvious animal. No visitor at the door. Nothing we could see that justified the reaction. At first, I assumed he had heard something outside. Dogs can hear far better than we can. A person walking down the street, another dog nearby, an animal under the house, or even pipes moving can get their attention. There is nothing unusual about a dog barking at something humans cannot hear. But he would not settle. He kept barking. Eventually, someone opened the back door so he could go outside and relieve himself. The moment the door opened, he bolted. He did not calmly walk into the garden. He ran straight to the far end. Then he stayed there. That was strange. Normally, a dog that wants to go outside does what it needs to do and eventually comes back toward the house. He did not want to come near it. He remained at the far end of the garden for more than an hour. Every now and then, he would turn toward the house and bark aggressively. That was the part that really got to me. He was not barking at something in the garden. He appeared to be barking at the house, from as far away as he could reasonably get. Watching him stand there made the memory of the hallway come back immediately. The timing was too close for my mind not to connect the two. 2 days earlier, I had seen what looked like someone standing in the utility room doorway. Now our normally well-behaved dog seemed frightened or angry at something inside the house. I started wondering whether he could see whatever I had seen. That thought gave me a horrible feeling. Animals have always been part of paranormal stories because they react to things differently from people. Dogs hear frequencies we cannot. They smell things we never notice. They detect tiny movements. Because of that, when a dog stares into an empty corner or refuses to enter a room, people immediately start wondering whether it senses something supernatural. But there are countless ordinary reasons for that behavior, too. There could have been an animal inside the wall. A mouse. A rat. Something beneath the floor. An unfamiliar smell from the previous owner. Pests in an attic or crawl space can make noises that are obvious to a dog and completely invisible to people. The dog may have heard something near the utility room or inside the structure and interpreted it as a threat. Once he became frightened, he might have associated the entire house with the sound. Running outside would create distance. Barking back at the house would be a normal defensive response. That explanation makes sense. We had also only recently moved in. The house was new to the dog, too. He was dealing with unfamiliar smells, rooms, noises, and surroundings. Dogs can become anxious after moving. A house that feels normal to humans can be overwhelming to an animal because every surface carries scents from previous people and pets. If the elderly woman had lived there for decades, her smell and the smell of her belongings may still have been present in the floors, walls, furniture, or garden. To the dog, the house could have been full of evidence that strangers had been there. That does not require a ghost. Still, the way he behaved that day was difficult to watch without thinking about the silhouette. I did not immediately tell everyone those two things were connected. I am not even sure I made the connection at first. It took me a little while. But once I did, the house changed for me. Before, it had been unfamiliar. Afterward, it felt occupied, not constantly. I did not walk around seeing figures every day. Nothing jumped out at me. There were no voices in the walls or objects flying across rooms. It was more subtle than that. I developed a bad feeling about the place. Whenever I passed the hallway, I would glance toward the utility room. Sometimes I did it without thinking. I wanted to make sure the doorway was empty. If I had to walk down the hall at night, I became more aware of the darkness. A room that had been completely ordinary before now carried the memory of that shape. That is another thing fear does. It assigns importance to locations. Once you see something frightening in a doorway, every future visit to that doorway contains part of the original memory. Even if nothing appears again, your body remembers. You look. You listen. You prepare yourself. The house itself did not become dramatically more active after that. At least, I do not remember any other major event happening directly to me. That is important, because it makes the experience easier to explain naturally. I had one extremely brief visual impression. Then, our dog behaved strangely a couple of days later. Those two events may have had nothing to do with each other. If months of unexplained activity had followed, I might feel differently. Instead, I spent about another year living there with mostly just that uncomfortable feeling. The silhouette itself may have been one of those mistakes the brain makes in unfamiliar environments. Maybe there was a difference in light between the hallway and utility room. A shadow cast by an open door could have formed a roughly human outline. Maybe something outside a window moved. A person walking past the house could cast a shadow through another room for an instant. Because I looked so briefly, I had no chance to inspect it. The image may have vanished because the lighting changed before I looked again. That would explain why there was no physical object in the room that matched it. It did not need to be an object. It could have been a temporary pattern of shadow. The fact that I thought nothing of it at first actually supports that possibility. If I had seen a clearly defined stranger standing inside my house, I probably would have reacted immediately. I would have shouted. I would have backed away. Instead, my brain casually labeled the shape as a family member. That suggests the image was vague enough to be ordinary. Only after everyone came downstairs did it become frightening. In other words, the fear came from information I learned afterward. The visual experience itself was not terrifying until I realized no one should have been there. That matters. Memory can strengthen once an event gains emotional meaning. The half-second glimpse might have originally been much less clear than it feels now. After realizing everyone was upstairs, I replayed it. Then the dog behaved strangely. Now the image became connected to the previous owner. An old woman had died. Maybe I saw her. Once that possibility exists, the silhouette becomes more defined in memory, even though I never actually saw a face. I have no reason to say it was the old woman. I did not see an elderly person. I saw only a person-shaped silhouette. For all I know, if there was anything paranormal in the house, it could have had nothing to do with her. But naturally, she was the first person I thought about. She had lived there before us. She had recently died. We moved in afterward. Then I saw someone where nobody living should have been. It is almost impossible not to connect those facts. Still, houses do not automatically hold on to their previous owners. The fact that someone died does not explain a shadow. There is no evidence that the woman died inside the house either. At least not from what I knew. She could have died in a hospital or somewhere else entirely. Her connection to the experience was mostly created by timing. The dog made that story feel stronger. If I had simply seen a silhouette and nothing else happened, I could say I was mistaken. But watching an animal appear genuinely afraid of the house less than 2 days later made me wonder whether there was something external that both of us had detected in different ways. That is the paranormal version. I see a presence. The dog senses it afterward. We both react. The ordinary version is just as straightforward. I see a shadow. 2 days later, the dog hears or smells something in an unfamiliar house. My brain connects two unrelated events. That is how patterns form. Humans are extremely good at noticing coincidences that support an idea and forgetting the thousands of ordinary moments between them. How many times did the dog enter the house without hesitation? Probably hundreds. How many times did I look down that hallway and see nothing? Countless times. Those normal moments do not stay in memory. The strange ones do. So when I look back, the house feels more active than it may actually have been. That does not make the events untrue. It only changes how much weight they deserve. I have sometimes wondered whether the dog might have been reacting to weather, sound, or scent coming from the utility room. Utility rooms contain machines, boilers, water heaters, washing machines, pipes, electrical systems. Any of those can produce noises people barely notice. A failing appliance may create high-pitched sounds outside human hearing. Dogs can detect frequencies we cannot. If something mechanical had begun vibrating or whining, he might have found the house genuinely unbearable. That could explain why he rushed outside and stayed at the far end of the garden. Once the noise stopped, he would eventually return. The aggressive barking might have been directed at the source of the sound. If the utility room contained equipment, that explanation becomes especially plausible. The hallway silhouette and the dog incident may have accidentally shared the same location without sharing the same cause. Another possibility is that an animal had gotten inside or under the house. Rodents often move through walls at night or in quiet areas. Dogs can hear them. If one was near the utility room, the dog might stare or bark at what looked like empty space. When taken outside, he might continue barking toward the building, because the smell or sound came from inside. We might never find the animal. Again, nothing supernatural required. But logic did not fully remove the feeling. For the rest of the year we lived there, the house never felt completely comfortable to me. I would not say I was terrified every day. Life went on. I slept, I ate, I watched television, I left for school and came home. But there was always that small awareness in the back of my mind, especially around the hallway. Sometimes I would catch myself looking toward the utility room before walking past. If the room was dark, I would switch on a light. I did not want to repeat that half-second glimpse. The strange thing is that I never did. No second silhouette. No old woman standing in the doorway. No face watching from the hall. Nothing, in a way, that made it more unsettling. A repeated event can eventually be investigated. If I had seen the same figure every Tuesday at 5 in the afternoon, I could look for lighting patterns or reflections. One isolated glimpse gives you nothing. You cannot recreate it. You cannot prove it happened. You cannot even prove what you saw. I have also thought about whether expectation played a role, because we knew an elderly woman had died before we moved in. Even if I consciously thought nothing of it, the information was in my mind. Maybe part of me already associated the house with death. When I saw a vague shape, that background knowledge could have made it feel more human. After the dog incident, the association became even stronger. This is how places develop reputations. One family has a strange experience. They tell the next person. The next person starts paying more attention. Every unusual sound becomes part of the story. I do not know whether the people who lived there after us experienced anything. I have wondered. Part of me would like to know. If someone completely unaware of our story later described seeing a figure in the same utility room doorway, that would be hard for me to dismiss. If they lived there for years without anything strange happening, that would support the idea that my experience was simply perception and coincidence. But I never followed up. Maybe that is for the best. Sometimes answers do not actually make old memories easier. The part involving the dog has stayed especially vivid because animals are difficult to reason with. You can tell yourself you imagined a shadow. You cannot easily tell a frightened dog that there is nothing there. But dogs also become afraid of things we do not understand. A smell, a frequency, a vibration, another animal, even a bad association from something that happened earlier. His fear was real. The question is only what caused it. He may have been reacting to something completely ordinary that was invisible to us. At 15, though, I did not think through all those possibilities. I saw him running as far from the house as he could. I watched him turn around and bark at it. And I thought about the silhouette. That was enough. Once I connected the two events, the house felt wrong. I remember wondering whether the old woman had never left. Maybe she did not know she had died. Maybe she was still walking through the rooms she had lived in for decades. Maybe I had caught her standing in the utility room for one fraction of a second. Maybe the dog had seen her more clearly than I had and wanted nothing to do with the house. That idea scared me. But there was also something sad about it. If the presence was really the previous owner, why would she be threatening? This had been her home long before it was ours. She had probably spent years there, maybe decades. She would have known every room better than we did. We were the strangers. That thought sometimes made the house feel less frightening. Then I remembered the way the dog barked. He did not behave as though something gentle was standing inside. He looked alarmed, maybe protective, maybe angry. That pushed my imagination back in the other direction. What if the silhouette had nothing to do with the old woman? What if something else had already been in the house? Again, that is pure speculation. I never saw enough to identify anything. I think that is where the experience should stay. I saw a human-shaped silhouette where no person should have been. Less than 2 days later, my dog behaved as though he desperately wanted distance from the house. Those are the facts as I remember them. Anything beyond that is interpretation. There are strong, ordinary explanations for both. A trick of light or peripheral vision for me. An unseen sound, smell, animal, or stress response for the dog. The timing made them feel related. That does not mean they were. We moved out about a year later. By then, I was happy to leave. Not entirely because of those incidents. Life moves on, families move, circumstances change. But I remember feeling relieved that I would not have to look down that hallway anymore. Once we were out of the house, the bad feeling faded. Nothing followed us. I did not start seeing silhouettes in the next place. Our dog did not behave the same way toward every house. The experience stayed connected to that one building. That could mean there really was something unusual there. Or it could simply mean the original event created an association I never carried anywhere else. I still think about how fast it happened. Half a second. That was all. If I had been looking directly down the hallway for 5 seconds, maybe I would know what I saw. Instead, my eyes flicked toward the utility room and caught a shape. My brain registered person. Then I looked away. By the time I understood there should have been nobody there, the moment was gone. I checked. The doorway was empty. There was nothing standing nearby that looked remotely human. Then, before I had really stopped thinking about it, our dog reacted to the house in a way I had never seen from him before. Maybe those two events were completely unrelated. That is what I usually tell myself. It is the explanation that makes the most sense. But even now, when I picture that house, I do not first remember my bedroom or the front door. I remember standing there ready to go shopping, glancing down a long hallway for less than a second, and seeing someone silently standing in the utility room doorway. Then I remember every member of my family coming down the stairs behind me. And less than 2 days later, I remember our dog running to the farthest end of the garden and refusing for more than an hour to come anywhere near the house I had just seen someone standing inside. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. A few friends and I once went camping on a mountain together. There were 5 of us in total, and trips like this were something we did because we enjoyed getting away from work and everyday life for a while. We liked being outdoors, whether that meant camping in the mountains or somewhere deep in a forest. There was nothing unusual about this particular trip when it started. We reached the area with enough daylight left to hike from the parking spot and find somewhere suitable to camp. The place we chose was roughly an hour's walk from where we had left the car, so we were not extremely deep in the wilderness. But we were far enough away that once the sun went down, we felt completely separated from everything. We set up the tents before sunset. By the time it became dark, everything was ready. We made a campfire, cooked, and settled in for the night. It was the kind of evening we had wanted. No work, no traffic, no phones constantly demanding attention. Just 5 friends sitting around a fire on a mountain, talking about whatever came to mind. Around 10 at night, a man appeared near our camp. That was the first strange thing. I do not remember hearing him approaching from far away. Maybe we were distracted by the conversation and the sound of the fire, but suddenly there was this man standing close enough to speak to us. He looked to be in his mid-20s. Nothing about his face immediately frightened me. He looked like a normal young man. His clothing was what made everyone pay attention. He was wearing formal clothes, a white shirt, a black tie, a black coat. It looked like something a person might wear to an office, a formal event, or maybe a funeral. Not something anyone would normally choose for hiking on a mountain late at night. Even stranger, his clothes were soaked. They looked wet enough that he had clearly been exposed to water or heavy rain. I do not remember it raining heavily at our campsite at that moment, which made his appearance even harder to understand. We looked at one another, but nobody immediately challenged him. There were plenty of possible explanations. Maybe he had been caught in rain somewhere else on the mountain. Maybe he had fallen into a stream. Maybe there was some road or property farther away that we did not know about. Perhaps he had been attending some formal event and ended up stranded. His clothing looked completely ridiculous for the environment, but ridiculous did not mean dangerous. He asked whether he could sit near our campfire for a while so he could warm himself. We felt bad for him. Whatever the reason he was out there, he was soaked and apparently cold. So we told him he could sit down. He chose a place close to the fire. One of our tents was directly behind him, so when he sat, his back faced the tent. At first, we tried to be friendly. If a stranger suddenly joins your campsite in the middle of the night, you naturally want to know who he is and what he is doing there. We asked questions. Where had he come from? Was he hiking? Was he lost? I do not remember getting any satisfying answers. He did not completely ignore us. He would respond now and then, but he never stayed in a conversation for long. He seemed much more interested in watching the fire. He would sit quietly, staring into the flames. After a while, we stopped trying so hard to talk to him. We offered him hot chocolate. He refused. That was another small detail that felt odd. He had specifically asked to sit by the fire because he was cold and wet, yet when we offered him something warm to drink, he did not want it. That by itself means nothing. Not everyone likes hot chocolate. Maybe he was cautious about accepting drinks from strangers. Maybe he was nauseous. Maybe he simply wanted heat. Still, it added to the feeling that something about him was off. The 5 of us gradually shifted a little farther from him. We were still close enough to keep an eye on him, but we stopped treating him like another person who had joined the group. He became more like a stranger we were temporarily allowing to use our fire. None of us could explain exactly why we felt uneasy. The suit was strange. His silence was strange. The fact that he was soaking wet was strange. But individually, none of those things meant much. There was just a feeling. Something was not right. He never threatened us. He did not ask for money. He did not try to enter our tents. He did not behave aggressively. He mostly sat there and stared at the fire. In some ways, that made it worse. If he had acted drunk or obviously confused, we would have had an explanation. If he had been injured, we could have offered help. If he had been lost, we could have pointed him toward the parking area. Instead, he seemed calm. Too calm, maybe. He acted as if sitting beside 5 strangers on a mountain at 10 or 11 at night while dressed in a soaked suit was completely normal. Time passed. He stayed with us for more than an hour. By around 11:30, we were tired and decided it was time to go to sleep. The stranger was still sitting by the fire. That created an awkward situation. Nobody wanted to leave an unknown man sitting in the middle of our campsite while all 5 of us climbed into tents and fell asleep. We did not know him. No matter how harmless he seemed, that would have been foolish. So we got up and started moving around, hoping maybe he would understand that we were ending the night. That was when I noticed the shadow. He was sitting between the campfire and the tent behind him. The fire was bright enough that our own shadows were visible. The light moved constantly because flames flicker, so shadows stretched and changed across the ground and tent fabric. But there was something wrong with the area behind the man. His body should have blocked the firelight. There should have been a human-shaped shadow on the tent. There was not. At first, I assumed I was looking from the wrong angle. Firelight is irregular. It does not behave like one steady lamp. There are multiple flames at different heights, and depending on where someone is sitting, light can wrap around them in strange ways. Maybe the tent was being illuminated from another side. Maybe the brightest part of the fire was not lined up with him. I moved slightly. I looked again. Still nothing that looked like his shadow. I became more focused on it. Once I noticed it, I could not stop looking. There was a man sitting directly in front of a bright fire, and somehow the tent behind him was still illuminated. I remember thinking that there had to be some simple explanation. There always is. Maybe another lantern was shining toward the tent. Maybe moonlight was filling in the shadow. Maybe the fire was wide enough that flames on either side of him lit the fabric behind him. All of that was possible. Then one of my friends accidentally pointed a flashlight toward him. I do not remember why. Maybe he was looking for something around the campsite. Maybe he was checking inside one of the tents. The beam swept across the stranger, and the light appeared to continue directly onto the tent behind him. That was the moment all of us became truly frightened. The beam should have stopped on his body. If you point a flashlight at a person, their shirt, coat, face, or back reflects the light. You see the person brightly illuminated, and the area behind them becomes blocked. Instead, from where we were standing, it looked as though the flashlight passed straight through him. The tent behind him lit up. I do not mean he became transparent in the way someone does in a movie. I still saw him sitting there. But the flashlight did not seem to react to his body correctly. It was as if the beam ignored him. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. We looked at the tent, then at him, then at each other. I could tell from my friends' faces that they had noticed the same thing. That was important. If I had been alone, I could have blamed my eyes. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the fire had affected my night vision. Maybe I was looking at the wrong angle. But all of us suddenly became quiet. Nobody needed to explain why. We knew what we thought we had just seen. The stranger remained seated. He did not react to the flashlight. He continued facing the fire. I was trying to find some explanation that made sense. Perhaps the flashlight beam had actually struck the black coat and was difficult to see because the fabric absorbed much of the light. A black coat can reflect much less than a pale tint. If the beam was wide, some of it could have gone around his body and brightly illuminated the tent, creating the illusion that it had gone through him. That is completely possible. Our eyes were adapted to the orange light from the fire. A bright flashlight suddenly entering the scene could have made depth and contrast difficult to judge. The tent behind him may simply have been much more reflective than his dark clothing. His missing fire shadow could also have had a similar explanation. The campfire was not a single point of light. If flames were spread across a wide area, light from one side could fill the shadow produced by light from the other. The result might be a surprisingly weak or almost invisible shadow. At night, with fabric moving and flames flickering, it would be easy to misread. Those are the explanations I think about now. At the time, none of us were thinking that calmly. We were standing in the mountains around midnight with a stranger in a soaked suit who seemed not to interact with light. The situation suddenly felt completely different. For the next several minutes, nobody knew what to do. We did not want to confront him. What would we even say? Why don't you have a shadow? If he was a normal person, we would sound insane. If he was not a normal person, none of us wanted to provoke him. So we stayed where we were. The man continued sitting beside the fire. I became extremely aware of how far we were from the parking lot. An hour's hike had felt like nothing during daylight. Now it felt very far. Our car was not beside the tents. There was no building we could immediately enter. No security, no staff, no other group close enough to hear us easily. We had come into the mountains to get away from people. Now that isolation felt like a terrible idea. Around 5 minutes after the flashlight incident, the man finally turned toward us. I expected something frightening. A strange expression. Anger. Maybe he would ask why we were staring at him. Instead, he smiled. It was not a creepy smile. That somehow made the moment stranger. It was completely normal. The kind of polite smile you might give a stranger when you pass them on a sidewalk. There was no threat in it, no huge grin, no unnatural expression. He simply looked at us and smiled as though everything was fine. Then, he stood up. Again, I watched carefully. I expected some other impossible thing. Nothing happened. He looked like a normal man getting to his feet. He did not say much. Then he walked away from our campsite. We watched him leave. I do not remember anyone trying to stop him or asking where he was going. We were relieved. The farther he moved from the fire, the harder it became to see him. Eventually, the darkness swallowed him. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then everyone started talking at once. Did you see that? What the hell was that? Did the flashlight go through him? Where was his shadow? All 5 of us had noticed enough of the same thing that nobody laughed. We started going over what had happened. Maybe it was just the light. Maybe the coat was too dark. Maybe the angle from the flashlight made it look strange. Maybe the fire created multiple shadows that canceled each other out. There had to be an explanation. But even if the lighting could be explained, we were still left with the man himself. Where had he come from? Why was he wearing formal clothing on a mountain? Why was he completely soaked? Why was he wandering around that late? Why did he want nothing except to sit silently beside our fire? Where was he going after midnight? We had no answers. Someone suggested that he might have been involved in an accident. Maybe there was a road somewhere beyond the trail. Perhaps he had been in a car crash and wandered into the mountain disoriented. That could explain the formal clothes. It could explain why he was wet if the vehicle had gone into water or if he had crossed a stream. It could explain the strange behavior, too. A person in shock can seem detached, quiet, and emotionally flat. If that was the case, we should have asked whether he needed help. We should probably have called someone. At the time, though, the missing shadow had completely changed our interpretation. We were no longer thinking about a lost or injured person. We were thinking about getting out. Another possibility was that he had attended some formal event nearby. Maybe a wedding, a funeral, a party. Then, something happened, and he decided to walk. We did not know the surrounding mountain well enough to say there were no houses or event venues beyond the paths we used. He could also have been messing with us. Maybe he knew campers used that spot. Showing up in a suit at night and behaving strangely could be an effective prank. He would not even need to create the missing shadow effect intentionally. Our fear might have done the rest. But if it was a prank, it was a strange amount of effort. He was soaked. He stayed beside the fire for more than an hour. He barely spoke. Then he simply left without revealing the joke. There was no group of friends laughing nearby, no camera that we could see, no payoff. That does not make a prank impossible, just less satisfying as an explanation. We briefly tried to sleep. None of us really could. The fire burned lower. The tents that had felt comfortable before now felt thin and exposed. Every sound outside made us listen. A branch moving, whined through leaves, something small in the brush. I kept imagining that the man had returned and was standing outside one of the tents. The worst part was that he had not been aggressive. If he had threatened us, we could have reacted normally. We could defend ourselves or leave. Instead, he had been polite. He asked to warm himself. He refused to drink. He watched the fire. He smiled. Then he left. There was nothing in his behavior that justified panic, only the feeling that something about him did not fit. Eventually, around 1 a.m, we decided none of us wanted to stay until sunrise. We packed what we could and left. Walking back toward the parking area in the middle of the night was not something we had planned. We had chosen the campsite specifically because it was around an hour from the cars. Now we had to cover that distance with flashlights while constantly looking around us. Nobody talked much. Every dark shape between the trees seemed important. We expected to see the black coat again. I kept watching the path ahead, wondering whether he would suddenly be standing there. He never appeared. We reached the parking area without anything else happening. We got into the vehicle and left. Once we were away from the mountain, the whole thing started feeling less impossible. Distance does that. Under electric lights, inside a car, you can start breaking an experience apart. The missing shadow could have been caused by multiple light sources. The flashlight could have illuminated the pale tint around the edges of his dark clothing, making the beam appear to pass through. Our eyes were tired. We had spent hours looking at a campfire, which can affect night vision. The man's appearance was strange, but not impossible. A lost person can be wearing any kind of clothing. A wetsuit is weird on a mountain, but there are streams, rain, accidents, and countless circumstances we did not know about. He may have sensed that we were uncomfortable and decided to leave. His polite smile might simply have been his way of thanking us. That explanation makes the most sense. But none of us could forget how we had reacted when the flashlight hit him. It was not one person saying, "Hey, where's his shadow?" and convincing everyone else afterward. We saw the beam. We looked at each other. The change in the group was immediate. Something looked wrong. Over time, I have become less certain about exactly what the light did. Memory is not a camera. The story becomes cleaner every time it is remembered. Maybe the flashlight beam did not literally pass through the center of his body. Perhaps it illuminated the tent strongly around his outline, and in the shock of the moment, we remembered it as passing straight through. Maybe there was a faint shadow we failed to notice, because the tent was already unevenly lit by the fire. We were also tired. It was almost midnight. Fatigue affects perception. That is important, because the supernatural interpretation depends almost entirely on a visual effect, under very poor lighting conditions. If the same thing happened at noon, it would be much harder to explain. At night, beside a campfire, visual mistakes are common. Firelight constantly changes direction and brightness. Shadows disappear and return. Dark clothing loses detail. A black coat can blend into the background. A flashlight can overexpose whatever it hits behind a dark foreground object. All of that can create strange effects. I know that now. Still, the timing bothered us enough that 5 people abandoned a campsite in the middle of the night. None of us wanted to admit we were frightened at first. We were adults, or close enough to adults to feel embarrassed about running away from a man who had done nothing threatening. But nobody suggested staying. That tells me the fear was shared. Maybe shared fear was all it was. One person becomes tense. Everyone notices. Then, someone points out the strange lighting. Now, the entire group starts interpreting the stranger through the same fear. It becomes contagious. The 5 of us may have reinforced one another until leaving felt like the only sensible choice. That happens easily in isolated places. There is also something psychologically uncomfortable about a person appearing where they seem not to belong. If he had worn hiking boots, outdoor pants, and a jacket, we probably would have accepted him immediately. The formal clothes made him seem impossible before anything else happened. From the moment he arrived, our brains were already searching for what was wrong. Then the soaked fabric. Then his quiet behavior. Then the refused drink. Then the light. Each detail added to the same pattern. If the man had been dressed normally, maybe the missing shadow would have been dismissed as nothing. Context matters. Even now, I do not know what I believe. I do not claim we met a ghost. There is not enough evidence. We saw a living-looking man. He spoke. He sat down. He responded to us. He stood up and walked away. We did not watch him vanish. We did not see him pass through anything. He did not know things he should not have known. The only apparently impossible detail involved light and shadow, and that is exactly the kind of thing that can be misread around a campfire at night. So logically, I think he was probably a real person. A very strange real person who had some reason to be on that mountain in wet formal clothes. But even that leaves questions I will never answer. I still wonder where he had been before he found us. I wonder where he went after leaving. If the parking area was an hour away, did he walk there in the dark? Did he have another campsite somewhere? Did he live nearby? Was he actually lost? Was he in shock? Should we have helped him instead of being afraid of him? Those questions bother me because the supernatural interpretation may have prevented us from recognizing a real person who needed assistance. Then I remember the flashlight. I remember seeing the tent behind him light up. I remember looking for the shadow that should have been there. And I remember all 5 of us becoming silent at the same time. Whatever the explanation, something about that moment convinced us not to spend the rest of the night on that mountain. The man never threatened us. He never raised his voice. He never even gave us a frightening smile. He only sat beside our fire in a soaked black suit, watched the flames for more than an hour, and eventually looked up at us with a polite expression before walking back into the darkness. Maybe the strangest part is that nothing dramatic happened. No chase, no attack, no apparition. He simply left. But when I remember him now, I do not first think about the suit or the fact that he was wet. I think about the tent behind him. The fire was burning between us. The flashlight crossed the campsite. Everything around him reacted to the light exactly the way it should. Except him. And after he smiled and walked away, 5 people who had hiked an hour into the mountains because we wanted a peaceful night in the wilderness decided we would rather make that same hike back in the dark than still be there if he came back. When I was very young, my family did not have much money. My parents had managed to save a little, including some money they had held on to from their wedding. But with 2 young sons and another baby on the way, they knew we needed more space. Eventually, they found a house in Cliftonville, a small town on the southeast coast of England. The price was unusually low. I know how that sounds now. A struggling family finds a huge, beautiful old house for suspiciously little money, moves in, and then strange things start happening. It sounds like the beginning of every haunted house story ever written. If I had heard this from someone else, I would probably be skeptical too. But this was where I grew up. The house was enormous compared with anything my parents should normally have been able to afford. It had 4 levels, a basement, the ground floor, another main floor above that, and then a top floor that was basically one large room with a small door leading into the attic space. The house was very old. From records and things we found connected to previous occupants, my family believed people associated with the property had served as far back as the Napoleonic Wars. Whether every piece of family history we heard was completely accurate, I cannot say now. But there was no question that the building had been standing for a very long time. The top room had apparently once been used as accommodation for a maid. The house had originally been quite grand. My father loved it. He was extremely proud that he had managed to provide something so impressive for us. Before we moved in, he spent months renovating. He had friends helping him paint, repair things, strip wallpaper, fix damaged areas, and generally try to bring the place back to life. By the time we moved in, it looked like the kind of house someone could be proud to raise a family in. But I remember being scared there. A lot. The strange part is that as a child, I could not have explained what I was scared of. I was not constantly seeing ghosts. There was not some monster standing at the end of the hallway. I did not have one particular room I refused to enter. It was more like the house made ordinary things feel threatening. The stairs were probably the best example. My brothers and I would run down them. Not walk quickly, run. There was always this feeling that if you moved normally, someone was going to catch up behind you. You would start down the staircase and suddenly feel as though another person were only a step or 2 above. You would hurry. The feeling would stay with you. Then you would sprint the rest of the way. Once you reached the bottom and turned around, there was never anybody there. As children, we did not sit around discussing whether the house was haunted. We simply knew the stairs felt wrong. Doors were another constant problem. My father was always replacing locks. It seemed as if every few weeks one of us would somehow become locked inside a room. A lock would jam. A handle would stop working. A door that had opened perfectly well earlier would suddenly refuse to move. As a child, being trapped behind a door is terrifying. We would shout. Sometimes we would cry. We would bang against the door until our parents heard us and came to help. Then my father would repair or replace another lock. There are perfectly ordinary explanations for that. It was a very old house. Door frames shift over decades. Wood swells with humidity. Old locks fail. Poorly fitted replacements break. If the house had been altered repeatedly over generations, nothing would have been perfectly square anymore. A door that worked in the morning could stick later when the temperature changed. I understand all of that now. At the time, it just felt as though the house kept shutting us into rooms. Doors also slammed by themselves. We were always told the same thing. Drafts. It was a big old house near the coast. There were plenty of windows, chimneys, gaps, and pressure differences between floors. A partially open door could easily move when another door opened somewhere else. That explanation made sense, so we accepted it. That was generally how we treated strange things in the house. Something happened. An adult gave us an ordinary explanation. We moved on. There were so many small incidents that no single one seemed important enough to turn into a major family discussion. Looking back, I think that was part of what made the house unsettling. Nothing happened often enough or clearly enough to force anyone to deal with it. You could always shrug off the individual event, a broken lock, a draft, a misplaced object, a strange sound. Then another one happened, and another. As a child, I loved dinosaurs. I also loved pretending to be an archaeologist. My younger brother and I would go into the back garden and dig. We were looking for fossils, treasure, anything interesting. Instead, we found bones. A lot of bones. They were not human. At least nobody believed they were. They appeared to be animal remains, probably dogs or other similarly sized animals. Finding one or two bones in an old garden would not be particularly strange. People bury pets, animals die. Old properties accumulate all kinds of things beneath the soil. But we kept finding them. Eventually, we had collected roughly 5 buckets. Even as children, that seemed like a lot. 5 buckets of bones is not one pet. Maybe previous owners had buried multiple animals over many decades. Maybe the soil had been moved from somewhere else. Maybe the property had once been used in a way we knew nothing about. There are plenty of possibilities. To us, though, it was incredible. We were children digging up bones in the garden of an ancient house. It felt like archaeology. Then one day, a friend who was playing with us dug up something even better, a revolver. It was badly incomplete. The handle and trigger were missing. I do not remember the exact condition of the metal, but it had obviously been buried for a long time. To a child in England who mostly knew revolvers from films and television, it was one of the coolest things imaginable. We had found a real gun, or what was left of one. At the time, we were excited. As an adult, I look back and wonder what it was doing there. An old property can hide generations of discarded objects. The revolver may have had nothing to do with anything sinister. Someone could have buried or thrown away a damaged weapon decades earlier. It might have been an antique that was already useless when it ended up in the soil. But combined with the quantity of bones, it added another strange layer to the house. Most of what truly disturbed me, however, was not told to me until years later. When I was a child, my parents did not share everything they experienced. I think they wanted to protect us. If your children are already running down the stairs because they feel chased, telling them that adults are also seeing and hearing unexplained things would probably make the situation much worse. Years after we moved out, my parents told me more about the history and about what happened while they were living there. One story involved my uncle. He worked for British Gas and had actually been inside the house years before my family bought it. At that time, the property belonged to an elderly woman who apparently lived there alone. My uncle remembered her as friendly and talkative. While he was doing his work, she spoke about the house and her family. She told him that several generations of her family had lived there. She talked about her work as a Christian missionary. She mentioned her husband and her daughter. My uncle casually asked about the husband. She told him he had died several years earlier. Then he asked about her daughter. The woman's behavior changed. She told him her daughter had gone away. Then she asked him to leave the room. My uncle did. She closed the door, then she locked it. When he finished his work and needed to give her the invoice, she was still behind the locked door. She would not come out. Eventually, he had to slide the invoice underneath. He left without thinking much more about it. He never warned my father about the conversation before we bought the house because, from his perspective, there was nothing necessarily sinister about it. Families fall out. Adult children move away. People become emotional when asked about painful subjects. Maybe the daughter had cut contact. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe she had died, and the old woman could not bring herself to say it. My uncle had no reason to assume anything supernatural or criminal. It only became strange later because of what my father found while renovating. Before we moved in, he and his friends stripped wallpaper from some of the walls. Underneath were handwritten religious messages, biblical quotations about forgiveness, versions of the Lord's Prayer, religious phrases repeated across the wall beneath the wallpaper. I do not know exactly who wrote them. It may have been the elderly woman. It may have been someone from an earlier generation. Given that she had apparently worked as a Christian missionary, religious writing in the house was not necessarily unexpected. There could have been a completely personal reason for it. Prayer during grief, prayer during illness, a family tradition, someone writing scripture before redecorating. But when my parents connected it with the old woman's reaction to questions about her daughter, it became unsettling. The cellar added another mystery. Near the coal chute was a rectangular patch in the floor. According to my father, it looked disturbingly like the outline of a grave. It had been filled in crudely with concrete. Again, there are endless practical reasons for a rectangular concrete repair in the basement of an old building. There could have been a drain there, a damaged section of foundation, an old storage pit, a water tank, a structural repair, a utility trench, something connected with coal storage. None of us knew. But once someone joked that it looked like a grave, it became almost impossible not to see it that way. My father's friends loved winding him up about it. They bought him pickaxes as joke birthday gifts. They would ask him when he planned to dig up the body. It became one of those dark family jokes people use when something makes them uncomfortable. My father never opened it while we lived there. Part of him clearly wanted to know what was underneath. Another part did not. My mother had her own experiences connected with the cellar. She would sometimes hear what sounded like a woman singing from downstairs. At first, she assumed my father had left a radio on. That was the logical explanation. She would hear this faint female voice coming from below and think there must be music playing somewhere. But apparently, there were occasions when no radio had been left on. I never personally heard the singing. This is one of the stories my parents told me later, so I have to treat it as their memory, not mine. Old houses carry sound strangely. A radio in another room can travel through pipes or vents. A neighbor's music can seem to come from inside the building. Wind can produce tones. Boilers and plumbing can create sounds that resemble distant voices. People are especially good at hearing singing or speech in vague noise, so there are normal explanations. But my mother believed she heard a woman. Then there was something both of my parents apparently witnessed together. One night, they were watching television. The door to the room was partly open. While they were sitting there, a young woman leaned around the edge of the door. She looked into the room. Then she disappeared. Not an elderly woman, a young woman. My parents both saw enough to believe a person had just looked around the door. They checked. Nobody was there. That story bothered my father because he started connecting it with everything else he knew. The old owner's daughter who had gone away. The religious writing about forgiveness. The strange concrete patch in the cellar, the female singing, now a young woman looking into the room. But those connections were his interpretation. There was no evidence that the figure, if they really saw one, was the previous owner's daughter. There was no evidence anyone was buried beneath the cellar. There was no evidence that an illegitimate pregnancy, death, or secret burial had taken place. Those ideas developed later as my father tried to make sense of unrelated clues. The top floor had its own strange history. Because money was tight, my parents sometimes rented the large top room to students. Inside that room was a small cubbyhole, or storage area. At some point, we found very old baby clothes hidden there. They looked Victorian, or at least extremely old to us. Tiny garments stored away in a hidden part of the house. Again, an old house containing old baby clothes is not impossible. Families keep things. Clothing gets stored and forgotten. A servant or previous tenant may have packed them away decades earlier. But after everything else, the discovery felt ominous. Some of the students who stayed upstairs also complained about the children in the house. They would tell my parents that we were misbehaving at night. Apparently, they would be woken by someone rattling the door handle and then running away. That sounded exactly like something children might do. The problem was that my brothers and I were not doing it. At least I have no memory of ever playing that prank. The students thought we were waking them deliberately. They would hear the handle move. Then footsteps running away. They blamed us because who else would it be? I do not know whether those sounds had an ordinary cause. A loose handle can rattle. Drafts can move doors. Someone elsewhere in a large house can create footsteps that sound close. Students staying in an unfamiliar old building may also sleep lightly and interpret normal noises as children fooling around. But it became another event my parents could not easily dismiss. Over time, my mother had enough. I do not think there was one final dramatic incident that made everyone flee in the middle of the night. It was accumulation. The house had cost money. The repairs had cost money. My father had worked incredibly hard on it. Leaving was financially disastrous, but my mother no longer wanted to live there. We moved. The decision left my family close to broke. Most of the money they had put into the mortgage and renovation was tied up in that property. This was not a family casually walking away because a door slammed. Whatever combination of stress, strange events, financial problems, and fear was happening there had become serious enough that leaving felt worth the cost. For a while after we moved, that seemed like the end. Then my father became increasingly bothered by the cellar. He had developed a theory. Again, this was only a theory. He became convinced that a young woman might have died in the house and been buried beneath that concrete patch near the coal chute. In his mind, the pieces fit together. The old woman's daughter had gone away. The walls contained prayers about forgiveness. My mother heard a woman singing. My parents saw a young woman looking into the room. The cellar had a grave-shaped repair. The garden contained an unusual number of animal bones. The old baby clothing suggested children and family history. My father began imagining a tragic story in which a young woman had become pregnant outside marriage, died, and somehow ended up buried beneath the house because of shame or some family secret. There was no evidence proving any of that. It was a narrative built around the things we had discovered. But once my father became convinced, he could not stop thinking about the possibility that human remains were under the cellar floor. Months after selling the house, guilt got the better of him. He returned to speak with the new owners. He tried to explain what our family had experienced. Then he asked whether they would allow him to investigate the concrete patch. From his perspective, he was trying to do the right thing. If someone really was buried there, he believed the remains should be found and treated properly. From the new owner's perspective, however, a previous homeowner had arrived at their door talking about possible bodies beneath the cellar. They were extremely upset. They contacted the police. Later, former neighbors contacted my mother and explained that there were additional circumstances in the new family that made my father's visit especially badly timed. The new owner's wife had recently been detained for psychiatric care under the Mental Health Act. Because of what their family was already going through, they apparently thought my father's claims about a possible body or haunting were some kind of cruel joke or harassment. That part of the story is important to describe carefully. Their family's mental health crisis was not evidence that the house was haunted. There is no fair or responsible reason to connect someone being hospitalized for psychiatric care with paranormal activity. At the time, though, people around us naturally noticed the timing and whispered about it. That only added another frightening chapter to the story. Looking back, I think the most disturbing thing is how easily separate facts can be connected once a house has a reputation. A child runs down a staircase because he feels watched. That becomes evidence. A lock breaks. Evidence. Animal bones appear in the garden. Evidence. A broken revolver is found. Evidence. Religious writing is discovered behind wallpaper. Evidence. A rectangular concrete repair becomes a grave. An old woman refusing to discuss her daughter becomes a family secret. A voice in the cellar becomes a dead woman. A glimpse around a doorway becomes the daughter. A student hears a rattling handle and assumes ghost children. Once the story exists, everything feeds it. There may be perfectly ordinary explanations for almost all of it. The house was old and drafty. Bad locks are normal in old buildings. The bones could have belonged to generations of pets. The revolver could have been discarded decades earlier. The religious writing may have reflected nothing more sinister than a deeply religious resident. The concrete patch could have been a repair. The singing could have been pipes, radio signals, neighbors, or auditory misperception. The young woman my parents saw could have been a shadow or a brief visual mistake. The students could have been hearing normal movements in the building. All of those explanations are possible. And yet I cannot completely separate them from how I felt there as a child. That is the part I experienced directly. I did not know about the old woman and her daughter. I did not know about the writing beneath the wallpaper. I did not know my mother heard singing. I did not know my parents believed they had seen a young woman. I did not know my father would one day become convinced someone might be buried beneath the cellar. I was just a child living in a large old house, and I was scared. I remember running down the stairs because walking felt too slow. I remember being locked in rooms and crying until someone came. I remember doors slamming. I remember digging in the garden and filling bucket after bucket with bones. I remember how exciting it was when a friend pulled an old revolver from the ground. At the time, those things were not one story. They became one only later. That is why I still struggle with what to believe. If my parents had told me from the beginning that the house was haunted, I could blame suggestion. If someone tells a child there is a ghost in the basement, of course the child will become frightened on the stairs. But most of the adult stories were kept from us. I learned them years later. My childhood fear came first. That does not prove anything paranormal. Children are frightened by old houses all the time. The layout alone could have caused it. 4 floors, long staircases, a basement, an attic. Large rooms, unfamiliar noises, all the ingredients were already there. Still, hearing the adult stories later changed the memories. The stairs I once ran down because they felt creepy now became the stairs where perhaps someone unseen followed us. The doors that jammed became doors something was closing. The bones became part of a secret. The cellar became somewhere a body might be hidden. That is how memory can become darker, without any new event actually occurring. Sometimes I wish my father had been allowed to investigate the concrete patch properly, with the new owner's consent and professionals involved. If it had been opened and there was nothing beneath it except pipes or old building material, at least one mystery would be gone. If there had been animal remains or an old utility structure, the same. But that never happened. As far as I know, nobody ever proved there was a grave. Nobody proved the old owner's daughter died in the house. Nobody proved the singing voice belonged to anyone. The questions remained. That uncertainty is probably why the story sounds so much like fiction. There is a grand old house, a lonely elderly owner, a daughter who went away, prayers about forgiveness hidden under wallpaper, a grave-shaped patch of concrete, a woman singing in a cellar, a young female figure appearing around a door, old baby clothes in an attic room, children hearing footsteps, bones buried in the garden, an old revolver. It is almost embarrassing to list everything because it sounds designed. That is why I stopped telling people. You can see the moment skepticism appears on their faces. I understand it. I would probably react the same way, but when you live through something, the cliches do not arrive labeled as cliches. You experience one broken lock, one slammed door, one strange feeling on the stairs, one bucket of bones. Years later, someone tells you something else. Then another story comes out. Eventually, you look backward and realize how bizarre the whole period sounds when placed together. My father was probably the person most affected by leaving. He had loved that house. He had spent months restoring it. For him, buying it had represented success, a larger home for his growing family, something grand that he had managed to provide even though we were not wealthy. Walking away from it meant losing money and admitting that all his work had not produced the family home he imagined. That may be part of why he became so obsessed with finding an explanation. If there was something beneath that cellar, then leaving made sense. If there was a hidden family tragedy, then the atmosphere had a cause. Without that explanation, he had simply lost a house he loved because his family felt afraid. Human beings like causes, especially when something costs us a lot. My mother did not need proof. She just wanted out. In some ways, I understand her position better. Whether the experiences were supernatural or not did not really matter anymore. If a house repeatedly makes your family miserable, leaving can still be the correct decision. Maybe the building had bad drafts, faulty locks, difficult acoustics, old wiring, and decades of unsettling history. Maybe anxiety spread through the family. Maybe once enough incidents accumulated, nobody could relax there. That alone would be enough to make it an unhealthy place for us. You do not need a ghost for a house to feel haunted. Memory can do that by itself. Even now, I do not claim I know what happened there. I cannot say a young woman was buried in the cellar. That was my father's belief, not a proven fact. I cannot say the old owner's daughter was the woman my parents saw. I cannot say the religious writing was connected to guilt. I cannot say the students were being disturbed by something supernatural. I do not even know what species all those bones belonged to. What I know is that the house had an effect on us. It affected how we slept, how we moved through rooms, how quickly we ran down staircases, how often my father had to fix doors, how my mother felt about staying, how my father thought about the place years after leaving. It affected our finances when we gave it up, and it affected me enough that decades later, I still remember the fear before I remember almost anything beautiful about the building. That feels sad because my father had been so proud of it. There must have been good memories. There were 3 brothers playing there. A garden large enough to dig for dinosaurs. An enormous house that should have felt like an adventure. Yet when I think of it, I remember trying to get down the stairs before whatever I imagined behind me could catch up. I remember locked doors. I remember bones coming out of the soil. And then I remember learning years later that while we children were explaining all of those things away, the adults had been doing exactly the same thing. Drafts, old locks, bad plumbing, radios left on, shadows. Every incident could be explained. Maybe every incident was explained. But eventually there were so many explanations that my mother decided she no longer cared whether any of them were correct. We left. My father went back only once, months later, because he still could not stop thinking about that crude rectangle of concrete beneath the coal chute. The new owners wanted nothing to do with his theory, and after what their family was already going through, I cannot blame them. So the cellar remained untouched. As far as I know, whatever was underneath it is still unanswered. Maybe nothing was there. Maybe my father would have broken through the concrete and found dirt, an old drain, or a repair made 50 years earlier. That is probably the most likely answer. And yet, of everything about that house, the thought that stays with me most is not even the supposed grave. It is the fact that before I knew any of those stories, before anyone told me about the old woman, the hidden prayers, the singing from the basement, or the young woman at the door, my brothers and I already had one rule that none of us ever needed to explain. When you were on the stairs in that house, you ran. Because if you walked, it always felt like someone was coming down right behind you. My local public library has 3 main areas. The children's section and teen section are on the lower floor, along with a miscellaneous area, while the adult section is upstairs. Several years ago, I was sitting in the teen section studying for finals. It was an ordinary day. I had books and notes spread out in front of me, and I was focused mostly on getting through whatever I needed to study. People were constantly moving through the library, so I was not paying much attention to anyone around me. At some point, I noticed a man walk into the area between the children's and teen sections. He was a white guy with long blonde hair, a short beard, and a generally scruffy appearance. His hair was especially noticeable because it was extremely messy and disheveled. That was honestly the main thing I thought about him. I remember thinking he could probably use a comb. Nothing about him immediately frightened me. He was not acting aggressive. He was not yelling. He was not staring at anyone. He did not approach me. As far as I could tell, he was simply another person in a public library. He went over to one of the seats positioned between the teen and children's areas and sat down. I went back to studying. For the next half hour or so, I mostly ignored him. I do not remember watching him leave. That detail became important later. At the time, it meant nothing. People get up constantly in libraries. They use the bathroom. They walk to another section. They go outside to take a call. They browse shelves. Someone disappearing from a seat is completely normal. About 30 minutes later, I was ready to leave. As I was gathering my things, I noticed the man was no longer sitting there. His backpack was. It was black and red. I remember seeing it sitting alone on or near the seat where he had been. My immediate assumption was that he had gone somewhere and would come back. Maybe he was in the bathroom. Maybe he was using one of the computers. Maybe he was looking for a book. People leave bags near their seats all the time, especially when they expect to return in a minute. So I did not think anything of it. I did not report it. I did not ask a librarian about it. I did not look inside. I simply assumed it belonged to someone who was still somewhere in the building. I went to the library cafe, bought a croissant, and then left for my carpool. As far as I was concerned, that was the end of it. Roughly 30 minutes later, I got home. My brother's school was only about a 2-minute walk from the library. When I arrived home, he told me his school had been placed on lockdown because of a bomb threat. That immediately got my attention. He explained that someone had reported a strange backpack inside the library. According to what he had heard, librarians checked the bag, became concerned that it might contain some kind of explosive device, and evacuated the building. The bomb squad had been called. I realized almost immediately which backpack he was talking about. The black and red one. The one I had casually walked past. The one left in the seat between the children's and teen areas. I remember the feeling in my stomach when I made that connection. I had been sitting relatively close to it, maybe 15 or 20 yards away, and I had left only around 20 minutes before the evacuation began. Suddenly, what had seemed like an ordinary abandoned backpack became something very different. My first thought was how close I had been. If the device had worked and gone off while I was still studying, I could have been right there. That thought stayed with me. It is strange how quickly the meaning of an ordinary object can change after you learn new information. When I first saw the backpack sitting alone, it was just someone's bag. After my brother told me about the lockdown, I could picture it perfectly. Black, red, sitting there unattended. I started replaying everything I remembered about the man. His hair, his beard, where he sat when I last saw him, whether he had seemed nervous, whether he looked around before leaving. I could not remember anything obviously suspicious. That almost bothered me more. He had seemed normal enough that I barely registered him. Later that evening, I watched the local news. The story came on, according to the report. The suspicious device found in the backpack was missing several key components. The news did not give specific technical details, and I never learned exactly what was inside the bag. I only remember the report saying that the device was incomplete. There were also, according to the news coverage I saw, no suspects or obvious leads at that point. That part confused me. The library had security cameras. I knew there were cameras covering the entrances and exits. There were cameras in corridors. There were cameras around the computer areas. The children's and teen computer sections were separated only by a narrow walkway, and I remember there being a camera positioned very close to where that man had been sitting. From my perspective, it seemed almost impossible that nobody would be able to identify who had left the bag. If I had seen the man clearly enough to remember his hair and beard, surely a security camera had captured him too. That was what I thought. But there are plenty of reasons surveillance footage might not immediately produce a suspect. The camera may have been pointed at the area without capturing a useful view of his face. The footage may have been low resolution. He could have entered from an angle that did not show identifying details. Maybe there was video, but investigators simply had not identified him when the news report aired. A news station saying there were no suspects does not necessarily mean police had no footage. It only means nobody had been publicly identified at that point. There may also have been details investigators deliberately did not release. At the time, though, I did not think about those possibilities. I only knew that I had personally watched a strange-looking man sit down with a black and red backpack. Then he disappeared. Then the same backpack apparently caused an evacuation and bomb squad response. And now the news was saying no suspect had been identified. That made me feel as though I knew something important. But I did not tell anyone. That is something I still think about. At the time, I did not fully understand whether what I had seen mattered. I had not seen him build anything. I had not seen him open the bag. I had not seen what was inside. I had not even clearly watched him leave the backpack behind. I simply remembered a man sitting in the same place where the suspicious bag later remained. For all I knew, the backpack belonged to someone else. Maybe another person had sat there after him. Maybe he had left and someone else placed the bag there. Maybe the bag had already been beside the seat when he arrived. Memory becomes dangerously confident after a frightening event. Once I learned about the bomb scare, my brain naturally connected the man and the backpack. But that does not prove he was responsible. That distinction matters. I remember him. I remember the backpack. I remember seeing both in roughly the same location. I do not have evidence connecting him to what was later found inside. At the time, however, I could not stop imagining that connection. The man's face became fixed in my memory. Before the incident, he had been nothing more than a scruffy stranger I noticed for a few seconds. Afterward, every detail felt important. Long blonde hair, messy, short beard, white male. Maybe there had been something in his expression I missed. Maybe his behavior had actually been strange, and I simply did not notice because I was studying. I replayed it repeatedly. Did he look at the children's section? Did he look nervous? Did he leave quickly? Did he check whether anyone was watching? The honest answer is that I do not remember. Anything I add now would be guessing. That is one of the most frustrating parts. When something dangerous happens after the fact, you suddenly wish you had paid attention beforehand. You want to rewind your own memory like security footage. But you cannot. You only have the pieces your brain decided were worth storing at the time. And at the time, that man was not important enough for me to watch carefully. I have sometimes wondered what the purpose of the device was supposed to be. The location disturbed me. The seat was positioned between the teen section and the children's section. That naturally made me think about who would have been nearby if something had happened. Children, teenagers, parents, students studying, library staff. I have had the thought that whoever left it might have chosen the location because younger people used that floor. But I cannot know that. There is no way for me to prove motive from where a backpack was found. The person responsible could have chosen the seat because it was convenient. Maybe the goal was simply to frighten the library or the broader community. Maybe the device was never intended to function. Maybe the location was random. Maybe someone wanted an evacuation. Maybe it was some kind of cruel hoax. Those possibilities are all just speculation. I am careful about that now because fear can make motive seem obvious when it is not. At the time, though, the thought of the children's section bothered me badly. If someone had intentionally chosen that location, it felt especially disturbing. The fact that the device was reportedly incomplete made the entire situation even stranger. Was it supposed to work, and someone failed to assemble it properly? Was it deliberately built to look threatening without being functional? Was it something harmless that had been mistaken for a bomb? The bomb squad was called, so clearly the authorities considered it serious enough to evacuate people and take precautions. But I never learned what their final conclusion was. The news report only gave limited information. That left a huge gap between what I imagined and what I actually knew. In my mind, I had narrowly escaped an explosion. In reality, if the device was missing necessary parts, it might never have been capable of exploding at all. That does not make the situation harmless. A suspicious device in a public library can cause panic, evacuations, school lockdowns, and huge amounts of fear, even if it cannot function. But the difference matters when I think about how close I came to being hurt. I do not actually know that I was seconds away from an explosion. I only know I was close to an object that authorities considered suspicious enough to bring in the bomb squad. That is frightening enough, without exaggerating it. What stayed with me most was the timing. I had sat there for around half an hour. I saw the backpack. I bought food. I left. About 20 minutes later, the library was being evacuated. It made me think about how casually we move past possible danger every day. If I had stayed to finish another chapter of studying, I might have been inside when the alarm or evacuation started. If I had spent longer in the CAF, I might have been caught in the middle of it. If someone had decided to investigate the bag while I was sitting nearby, I would have watched the entire response happen. Instead, I left at exactly the right time to miss the chaos. That coincidence made the whole incident feel much closer. I also thought about what would have happened if I had opened the backpack. I am very glad I did not. At the time, I never considered touching it. It looked like someone's personal property. But people are curious. Another teenager might have picked it up to see whose it was. Someone might have moved it aside. A child might have opened it. That thought disturbed me. The safest thing about my own reaction was that I ignored it. Today, if I saw an unattended bag in a public place, under circumstances that seemed unusual, I would notify staff rather than investigate it myself. At the time, I was just a student thinking about finals and croissants. I had no reason to expect anything dangerous. The school lockdown also made the event feel larger than the library itself. My brother was not even inside the building. Yet his school was close enough that officials apparently considered the situation a potential threat to the surrounding area. That was when I understood that whatever had been found was being treated seriously. There is something deeply unsettling about hearing a family member casually explain that their school was locked down because of an object you had been sitting near less than an hour earlier. I remember thinking, I was just there. That sentence kept repeating in my mind. I was just there. I saw that bag. I saw the person sitting there. I walked right past it. Then, the authorities showed up. The man's appearance became associated with that feeling permanently. I have never seen him again. At least, I do not think I have. If I passed him today, I might not even recognize him accurately. Years have passed. Hair changes. Beards change. People age. And memory changes too. The image I carry now may be partly reconstructed. He may have been less disheveled than I remember. His hair might not have been as long. My brain may have emphasized his scruffy appearance after the event because I needed him to look suspicious. That is another possibility I have to acknowledge. Before I knew about the bag, I only thought his hair looked messy. That was the full extent of my judgment. After I learned about the bomb scare, messy-haired guy became possible person connected to a bomb. That change in context can reshape memory dramatically. We often imagine suspicious people looking suspicious in hindsight. But real dangerous people do not always look unusual, and unusual-looking people are not necessarily dangerous. His appearance proves nothing. If I had actually spoken to law enforcement at the time, I would have needed to stick to simple observations. A man with long blonde hair and a short beard sat near that location. I later saw a black and red backpack there after he was gone. That is all. I could not honestly say I saw him place it there. I could not say he owned it. I could not say what was inside, and I definitely could not say what motive he might have had. That is probably why I hesitated to tell anyone. Part of me worried I would waste investigators' time. Another part worried I would accuse an innocent person. And another part may simply have been overwhelmed. When you are young, you do not always understand when a small observation could matter to adults investigating something serious. Looking back, I probably should have told a librarian, my parents, or the authorities what I remembered, and allowed them to decide whether it was useful. Even incomplete information can sometimes help. But that opportunity passed. I never reported him. As far as I know, nobody ever asked me whether I had seen anyone near the bag. The incident faded from local attention. Life continued. The library reopened. My brother went back to school. I went back to studying. But I never completely stopped thinking about it. The most uncomfortable part is how ordinary the beginning was. There was no warning, no suspicious behavior obvious enough to make everyone leave, no person shouting threats, no dramatic countdown, just a stranger sitting in a library. Then an unattended backpack. Then, after I was already home, a lockdown. That is what makes real incidents feel different from fictional ones. In movies, danger announces itself. Music changes. The camera focuses on the bag. A suspicious character looks around before walking away. The audience knows which detail matters. In real life, there is no soundtrack. The important object looks exactly like every other object until someone discovers what is inside. I was sitting relatively close to it, thinking about finals. I probably looked directly at the backpack more than once without feeling any fear. That bothers me. Not because I think I should somehow have known. There was no reason for me to know. But because it reminds me how dependent we are on incomplete information. A backpack is just a backpack until it is not. A stranger is just another library visitor until something happens that makes you remember him. Even the cameras that seemed so reassuring afterward were not necessarily enough to answer everything. Maybe investigators did review footage. Maybe they tracked the person and cleared him. Maybe they determined someone else had left the bag. Maybe there were legal reasons no details were released. Maybe the local news report was simply too early to include new information. I do not know. The fact that I never learned the ending allowed the uncertainty to become part of the memory. For years, I thought about that man as though he must have been responsible. Now I try not to make that leap. He may have been completely innocent. He might have left the seat long before the backpack appeared. He might have owned the bag but had no idea something suspicious was inside. There are scenarios I cannot imagine because I had almost no information. That is why I do not want to turn him into a villain based only on my memory. Still, I cannot separate his face from that day. The association is too strong. When I picture the library, I can see the layout. The teen area, the walkway toward the children's section, the seat, the black and red backpack. Then the man with the long blonde hair sitting there earlier. I also think about how close the children's section was. That detail still makes me uncomfortable, even though I cannot know what it meant. The lower floor was specifically where younger people gathered. Teenagers studied there. Children used the computers. Parents sat nearby. If someone knowingly left a suspicious device there, the choice of location feels cruel, regardless of whether it could actually function. But I cannot say the goal was to hurt children. That was a fear I developed afterward, not a fact established by anything I saw. Maybe the entire goal was disruption. The school lockdown certainly showed how far the fear could spread. One object caused a library evacuation, police response, bomb squad deployment, and a nearby school lockdown. If someone wanted to scare the community, They succeeded without an explosion. Sometimes that is the point of a hoax device. But again, I never learned the official conclusion. All I had was one news report saying key parts were missing. The responsible way to remember the incident is to leave the unanswered parts unanswered. What I know is frightening enough. A strange backpack was left in a public library. Staff became concerned. People were evacuated. A bomb squad was called. A nearby school went into lockdown. The device was reportedly incomplete. And shortly before all of that happened, I had been sitting only a short distance away. I still think about the decision to get the croissant. It is such a stupidly normal detail. After studying, I got up. I saw the abandoned backpack. I assumed the owner would return. I bought food. Then I went home. Nothing felt urgent. Nothing felt dangerous. That ordinary sequence somehow makes the memory worse. If I had felt threatened, I could tell myself I escaped because I recognized danger. I did not. I left because I was finished studying. Pure timing. That is all. If I had been more productive and decided to study another half hour, I would have been there during the response. If I had gotten distracted talking to someone, same thing. The difference between being inside and outside that library was probably less than the length of a television episode. I sometimes wonder whether anyone else sitting nearby remembered the man. There must have been other people around. Libraries are public spaces. Maybe someone watched him enter. Maybe someone saw who actually placed the bag. Maybe staff had already noticed it before I left. Maybe investigators collected dozens of witness descriptions. My memory might have been completely unnecessary. Or maybe nobody else paid attention to him because, like me, they had no reason to. That possibility still bothers me. There could have been an entire room full of people who saw the same man, but never registered him as important. Then later, after the evacuation, each person would search their memory for clues. The truth may have been scattered across many witnesses who never knew what they had seen. I regret not saying anything. Not because I know my observation would have solved the case. It probably would not have. But I wish I had at least given someone the information. Let professionals decide if it mattered. That is what I would do now. At the same time, I understand why younger me stayed silent. I did not want to sound paranoid. I did not want to accuse someone without evidence. And once the news said there were cameras and investigators, I assumed they already knew more than I did. Surely they had footage. Surely they could see the seat. Surely they could identify who had been there. What could I add? Years later, I still do not know. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. The unanswered nature of the event is what keeps it alive in my mind. I never learned who left the backpack. I never learned exactly what the device was. I never learned whether the man I saw had anything to do with it. I never learned whether police eventually identified anyone. The story ends with uncertainty. That is uncomfortable, but it is also the truth. I do not want to invent a cleaner ending just because one would be more satisfying. What I remember most clearly is how completely my view of that ordinary half hour changed after I got home. While I was in the library, the man was just some scruffy guy with messy blonde hair. The backpack was just a backpack. The children's section was just the children's section. I was just a student trying to finish studying. Then my brother told me his school had been locked down. And in a matter of seconds, every harmless detail from the previous hour became something I could not stop replaying. I still see that black and red backpack sitting alone in the chair. I still see the man who had been sitting there earlier. I still remember walking away because I assumed whoever owned it would be back in a minute. Maybe that man was completely unrelated. I sincerely hope he was. But I have never been able to forget the fact that less than an hour after I noticed him and that bag, a bomb squad was standing inside the same library, dealing with something I had walked past without giving it a second thought. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.